Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this installment of our Prison Research Meets Practice series. My name is David Pitts. I'm the Interim Associate Vice President for Justice Policy here at the Urban Institute, where I also direct our Prison Research and Innovation Initiative, which is the project sponsoring this series with the generous support of Arnold Ventures. So before I delve into what we'll be covering today by way of topic and speakers, I want to cover some housekeeping items briefly. First of all, the event is being recorded, and the recording is going to be posted afterwards for you to access on the event page at urban.org. Also on that event page, you can reference some in-depth speaker biographies for the couple of folks that will be joining me here in a moment. For accessibility purposes, we're providing ASL translation, and we also have closed captioning enabled. So you can adjust your caption settings using the Show Hide Captions button within Zoom. All of the participants are muted, but if you do have questions, we ask that you type them into the Q&A box at any time over the course of our conversation, and we're going to save about 15 minutes to get to those questions at the end of the event. We ask that you please take a couple of minutes to complete our survey at the end of the event, and finally ask that you engage with us online using #LiveAtUrban. And so with that, I will ask our speakers for today to join me on camera, and I will provide a very brief introduction of them. And again, you can access some more in-depth information on each of our speakers on the event page. But first, we have Dr. TaLisa Carter, who is an assistant professor in the American University School of Public Affairs within the Department of Justice Law and Criminology. Dr. Carter is also a non-resident fellow at Brookings, an affiliate with the George Mason University Center for Advancing Correctional Excellence, as well as an affiliated scholar here at Urban. We also have Andie Moss, who is founder and president of the Moss Group, a leader within the field when it comes to corrections culture and workforce issues, and a frequent speaker at national events. And Andie has quite a bit of experience on the ground working with facilities and in facilities. And so I'm really happy both of them have joined today, given the different perspectives that they bring to the content. And so our topic for today is, as you saw in the invitation, workforce or correctional workforce rewards and sanctions. And the genesis for this session came from a book that Dr. Carter is, I think, in the final stages of editing, which is forthcoming by NYU Press, where she dives into the idea of how we think about praising and punishing COs and those working in corrections more broadly. And so I want to start, I think, with that specific framing in the questions that I ask of our guests. So TaLisa's book says explicitly in the first chapter that her book examines how correctional officers are praised and punished. And so maybe if we can, I'd like to start with TaLisa and ask her to talk a bit about why she chose that as the topic for a book that I know has taken more hours and days to complete than she might like to think at this point. TaLisa?
Yeah, thank you, David. And thank you so much, everyone I can't see in a virtual land. And of course, Urban and Arnold for this opportunity. And thank you to the interpreters for the work you're doing. While I'm talking, you are also talking. So I appreciate your presence in this space. So yeah, the book, right? I'm super excited about it. I recently was told that seeing as how I don't have children yet, this is kind of pretty close to it, right? And so it's on the last phases of gestation, and I'm very excited. But what really brought the book on is before I became an academic, in between undergrad and graduate school, I worked as a correctional officer, right? And then I went to grad school at the University of Delaware. And when I got there, I was really annoyed, right? Because it was clear that academics had told this story about how we're stressed and how we go through things, but they didn't really know us, right? They didn't know the people that I had the honor and privilege of working next to, right? And not everybody's honorable. And those distinctions really came out in the classroom. It came out of me in my conversations. It came out during exams when I said, hey, we're missing something. And so that's really the gap that the book fills. So praise and punishment is super important, these concepts, because when we think about accountability in the criminal justice system for practitioners, right, accountability is a bad thing. It's big brother, right? We're gonna get in trouble. But in reality, right, organizational literature tells us it's a spectrum, right? And employees respond better to praise. So what exactly then, what does it look like? I didn't even know what it looked like to praise a correctional officer. I attended an event at Urban when I first got to DC, and it was a really prolific quote. The guy said, a good CO never sees their work, like the benefits of their effort, because the point is that the incarcerated folks that you help, that you nurture, that you support, they don't come back, right? And then it's also illegal to kind of interact with them afterwards in a lot of cases. And so the complications around really understanding the value of praise, the value of sanction, and the intricacies that I think the Academy just hasn't quite spoke to yet, really inspired the work. And I'm so glad we're having this conversation.
Thank you, TaLisa. I appreciate that. And so, Andie, I want to turn to you next. As I mentioned a moment ago, you've been working in correctional environments for a long time in a variety of capacities. And so I'm wondering, based on your experience, if you think most DOCs get this balance of praise and punishment right, or if the balance is a bit off in some cases. I think you are unfortunately on mute, Andie. There we go.
Thank you. First of all, let me echo my appreciation for this topic and for Urban and Arnold and all of you that are making this happen, and certainly our participants. First of all, congratulations on having a book that's tedious and hard, and you're really hitting at something I have such a heart for, which is the relationship between what's really happening on the ground and how people perceive it, external folks, stakeholders, academics, researchers. And so I think you're giving a great gift to all of us to combine what your experience is and really moving this conversation forward. So thank you for that. I think it's a big question to say, what is the balance in all of corrections? I think as we know, there are many, many institutions and there are many, many leaders, but what intrigued me about the title or the discussion, I know we don't yet have your title of your great book, but the word punishment was really bothering me. And so as I look for just some synonyms around that, chastisement, retribution, imprisonment, and I think we've got too much punishment of officers. I think you also used, and just now, TaLisa, the word accountability. And I think if we can learn more about accountability, about professional development, about the real role of a supervisor in terms of developing people rather than punishing people, I think we're onto something that's really, really important. And it's extremely important in the environment that we're in. It's always been important. But I look forward to this conversation as we think about this dilemma. But you really hit me at my heart and at the work that our team does, being on the ground, working with a lot of officers, working with a lot of supervisors, and then also the executive leaders. So looking forward to this discussion.
Excellent, thank you. And so TaLisa, I'll turn to you next. And I think everybody probably on this call knows, unless they've been under a rock, that we're in the midst of a really, I think, difficult workforce crisis in corrections. Many DOCs are unable to recruit and retain the staff necessary for their systems to operate. And so, TaLisa, I'm curious if your research has shed any light on why we're in this situation, or if you have any thoughts about how we can get out of it.
Yeah, so such a powerful question. So the way I always introduce this topic is, to my students is, who wanted to be a correctional officer when they were kids, right? It's not in the societal kind of conscious to even take on this career path. And the adults who find their way to corrections, whether it's times of necessity, like for me, that's what it was, right? I didn't choose it. I was kind of thrown into it because of life circumstances. Whether it's kind of a second career path after the military, right? That's really common. Or a way to get into policing, right? Our law enforcement cousins who have a higher social status, right? One that's a little more respected and understood and visible, right? And so I think opening the conversation to understand that corrections is its own entity. It's not just kind of this baby sister or annoying cousin of policing, right? It needs to be respected as its own profession. And then also, what does professionalism in the discipline look like when we're behind bars for a reason, right? So we don't think about kind of the everyday experiences that we see in jails and prisons as something that, one, we want to know about. Honestly, the everyday citizen, I didn't do anything wrong, so why am I being exposed to it? Or when we are exposed to it through the media, it's kind of sensationalized fodder, right? Because the vast majority of time spent incarcerated is relatively boring, but you don't see that on MSNBC's Locked Up Raw. You don't see that love after lockup, love during lockup, right? You don't see that on Law and Order SVU, Law and Order the regular kind. You don't see that in the media. Right? That's not the clips that we click. That's not clickbait. It's not sexy. It's not seductive. It's not attractive. And so the implications of that then for recruiting and retaining people in the profession is that, one, people often don't really understand what they're getting into when they get into it, right? Because the framing is off. And two, the people that we think we want, right? So for example, college graduates, my research shows that college graduates by and far think corrections is the least attractive profession in the criminal justice system. And so the implications of that is that the people who are doing this work aren't the people who are going into IT and the alphabet soup agencies, right? They're not the same population, but we don't really treat them as such, right? We're still kind of saying, yeah, education matters and training matters, but we're pulling people that usually have a high school or GED equivalent. They don't have to have gone to college, right? They can make 6 figures using overtime, right? They have access to state and federal benefits, right? But all of these things are not mandated. And so what professionalism looks like, the field has to really reconcile with, because the populations that we usually want to hire are not attracted to the field for those reasons I mentioned, and a bunch I didn't get a chance to. Yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you, TaLisa. And Andie, I'm curious to get your reaction on that too. What are you seeing on the ground in your work with DOCs?
Well, I think your topic is so important. I think the workforce crisis is truly a crisis. And I think we are just beginning to understand what that really means and implies. All the points that TaLisa makes are so important, but I think it's also a time for such opportunity, because I think we have to reset what our expectations are, how we work, what our values are, how can we maintain our values with such a crisis in workforce. And I think maybe what I'll do is write a book called Exhaustion and Miracles, because you'll have to be the writer and I'll back you up. But I just think being online with the staff, they have so many human condition issues. They have their families they're trying to keep healthy and productive. They're trying, when we're working people double shifts and they're exhausted, we're not at our best, our judgment is not good. So I think the crisis with workforce needs a lot of unpacking, and we need to talk and engage our staff constantly, more than we ever have. To me, this is a time, and I sort of hesitant to say it, but this is my 40th year in corrections. And I've never seen such impact on workforce as what we're seeing now. And it's a difficult profession already, and it's a profession that has to have your heart and your head. And so it's just so important that we listen to our staff, but also think, what can we do that we haven't thought about before to really maintain professionalism? We've always been at the end of the pecking order with law enforcement, and law enforcement is having difficulty recruiting. McDonald's is having difficulty recruiting. So it's a time for courageous leadership. It's time for openness. It's time to reset our priorities and really understand how we're going to create and align with a mission that's very doable.
Yeah, I just want to jump back in because, Andie, what you said really made me think of the fact that money isn't the answer to this problem, right? Not in the way that kind of is done on commercials and stuff, like sign with us, you get a $10,000 bonus, $20,000 bonus, right? That just as fast as the money goes is as fast as people still burn out. Right? That's not the actual answer. So I just want to really throw that out there, because I think a lot of people really point to salary first, right? Which is why I said, you know, OT, overtime, it's really standard in corrections. Unfortunately, with this crisis, people have these opportunities, but money is not going to fix it, right? And so just integrating the question that popped up in the chat, like trauma-informed care, trauma-informed responses to the conditions that Andie mentioned for staff is really going to be invaluable for retention purposes, right? There's a little bit of training. It's hard because, like, I feel like when I went through training, there's nothing that could have prepared me for what it actually was, you know? So I hesitate, even though I do trainings myself, I hesitate to say that can be an end all be all because of just the dynamic nature of the job. But I will say that listening to people, trauma-informed care, and not always thinking that paying people more will help retain them, right? Where are you putting your resources to kind of really make sure that people are considered people, full humans, right, etc.
Right. And I think a number of systems, to their credit, have addressed higher pay. But what people do tend, I think the research shows that people leave because of poor supervisors, and the facility not having order, it's disorder, and so it's unpredictable. And so I think those are the real important issues we need to unpack more.
So I want us to shift. Thank you both for that. That was very interesting. And I want to shift back to something TaLisa sort of got us down the road on earlier, which is the media. And TaLisa suggested that maybe shows like 60 Days In and Love After Lockup are not a realistic depiction of what we see in our work with departments of corrections that are trying their best to run their facilities safely and with rehabilitative goals in mind. So, I think a lot of people would argue, and we might agree, that journalists should shine a light on what happens in prisons as a form of accountability. But as TaLisa notes in the draft of her book, in part that I was able to see, much of the media's coverage of correctional officers is limited to rare but pretty scandalous and sort of clickbait sorts of behaviors. And so I would like to hear from both of you, maybe first TaLisa and then Andie. How does this negativity, in your view, affect CO's ability to get their work done?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So yeah, there's a chapter on the media because a framing matters. So I have to be very transparent, right? This, reflexive moment. I watched Love during lockup last night. Just last night I watched it, the whole episode. It was interesting. And then my facility, the facility that I worked in Savannah, Georgia, has been on TV. It was like a month after I left and started graduate school. And I remember the kind of fervor around it, like excitement, right? That we would get the opportunity to show the facility and show kind of the steps and progressions that the institution had taken, the Sheriff's Department in Savannah. And so it's really interesting, right, to think about these things and how excited the people that I respect and worked with were to kind of have this opportunity, and also the realities and understandings of the way the media depicts and how I have to kind of challenge my students on these stereotypes that they're pulling, right, from Olivia Benson and colleagues, right? It's a really challenging thing to fight assumptions that are constantly being reinforced. And so I think that the mindset of correctional officers when you're doing this job, right? So working 12, 13-hour shifts, right? In some circumstances. And then you go home and people's understanding when hey, what do you do? Or run into the grocery store with your uniform on, or there's a feeling around it. That's kind of hard for me to explain, but people, the first question someone asked me when I was in jail was, why you want to be 5-0, right? And I'm a Black woman. It's a valid question, right? But that's 5-0 having this very narrow understanding, particularly in the context of corrections, particularly in the African-American community of which I'm a part. It's exhausting to be a correctional officer and exhausting to fight the stereotypes in everyday interactions, right? And it's hard to say that, it's hard to fight. It's hard to find the effort to do it and then still pour into people in a way that's beyond supervisory, right? In a way that goes towards the rehabilitative model that a lot of us are striving for. So I think that, one, it's exhausting. It adds an extra layer of burnout, an extra layer of misunderstanding that the everyday correctional employee has to face, not only when they're in, right, corrections, but when they're outside and living their lives.
Right. And 5-0, of course, being slang for law enforcement generally, for those who may not be familiar with that way of referring to folks. Andie, I'd like to hear from you next.
Sure. I'm going to take it a little bit more to the local level, because often the Moss Group is called in when there is a crisis and there is a lot of media attention. And so we have a good bit of experience of the reaction the staff have. And we're usually there to help them create a healing culture, one that is less toxic, one that they can operate in and feel pride in. And so I think one of the gaps that we really have is we don't prepare staff for media attention. And one of the ways we talk to staff is that, the media will always have, it goes back to my early days in my career when there was actually print, like newspapers, but the media will always have more print, but they'll also have more social media. They'll have more ability to surround you with the negative stories, and hopefully, and we're proud to have some positive stories, of course, But when the media is hitting hard on a facility, it's devastating. And we need to help the staff understand that the media has more resources than we do. And you can't fight the media on the level that you'd really like to fight to. So I think preparing our staff and recognizing that they're always, whether it's, there's some wonderful advocates we work with, it's really important to work with the advocates. And there are some people, whether they're advocates in the advocacy community or other communities, that their identity is based on you being wrong. And corrections is always going to have that challenge in that we're an easy profession to kick. And so instead of trying to take that away, I think working with staff about what that really is and how they need to recognize the importance of separating that out. And on the positive side, we do need the media. We do need the media to shine a light on issues. We do need good reporting. And I've been involved in many situations where that good reporting led to real reform and more resources for staff. So it's really an important area, but I think our big gap is that we haven't really helped staff understand the strategies of the media and the sort of the boundaries that staff need to put around themselves in terms of how deeply they take in some of the negative qualities that surround, and particularly in a crisis.
Thank you. So thinking a little bit about misconduct, this, obviously misconduct happens in workplaces everywhere. This is not at all unique to correctional officers, but sometimes I think it's certainly highlighted among correctional officers, maybe more so than the misconduct that the rest of us engage in at work, which is not nearly as interesting to the public. But if we think about it generally, and we think about, I guess, I want to think about how you frame it, TaLisa, in your book, not as, we talk a lot about correctional officers that do bad things as being bad apples, but you actually want to sort of turn that on its head and say that they're not really bad apples, but rather there's often a rotten barrel in which these apples exist. So I'm wondering if you might be able to talk us through how you sort of think about that metaphor and how it works.
Yeah, so rotten apples, I'm TaLisa.
But I'm sorry,
I said rotten barrels and rotten apples. So that's kind of a theoretical framework. Is very common in law enforcement, particularly policing. But what happens is, so a rotten apple is somebody does something wrong and you pluck the apple, right? You terminate them, you suspend them, you sanction them, you hold them accountable for their behavior, right? But acknowledging a rotten barrel is a little bit different. That's saying that, hey, these apples, they didn't just rot on the tree, right? They are in an environment under which, right, this kind of rottenness can spread, this poison can spread, this misbehavior, right, can spread. And I think that is really what we're missing in the conversation about accountability, which is the main point in the argument of the book, is that institutions should actually be really front and center when we're having these conversations about employee behavior. Again, not just in corrections, not just in criminal justice, but in every social institution, because they facilitate an environment in which misconduct can spread or misbehavior and malcontent can spread. And so how exactly does that happen in corrections? So for example, in training, right? In training, most times, it's an amazing study that came out recently, almost every institution, this training facility statewide, almost every state gives training on safety, security, how to do hand-to-hand combat, things like that. Right? Interpersonal communication skills, the vast majority, right, of states do that kind of training, but not to the same extent, right? Different hours and so forth, right? But far less, when you go into kind of the different types of interpersonal communication skills, handling, special cases like people that have suicidal ideation, which is incredibly high in jails and prisons, unfortunately, people that have different mental health challenges, right? The training for that gets lower and lower and lower. And so if the institution itself is not mandating that training for every employee, then how can one expect for an apple to stay good? Right? How can one expect for individuals who are essentially called to be jacks of all trades, right? We remember from what I said earlier that, people have high schools or GED equivalent. So we're expecting them to show up in these really tense spaces behind bars outside of society's purview, vast majority of the time. And they need to be social workers. They need to be security. They need to be, psychologists. They need to be transportation. They need to be all of these things, right? But training is not mandated that we can make all of these things possible for these folks. And then if you combine that with the retention crisis, the staffing crisis, right? Even if the training exists, getting people to training is incredibly difficult, right? Because we need people to work and secure the facilities themselves. So we can still have the training, but making it mandatory and actually getting people to where they need to be is still incredibly hard. So you have a logistical problem. So that's essentially the tenet of kind of this situation, is that you can't expect an apple to remain good if the conditions in which they sit, the barrel itself, is rotten.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm interested to hear from Andie on this, because I know, Andie, you think a lot about DOCs as institutions and organizations, right? And a lot of the work I think that you do in your organization is helping them as organizations think about the structures they have in place to make staff successful. I don't know if you have a reaction to TaLisa's comments just now, or if there are things you see on the ground in your work that either work really well or don't work so great in DOCs to facilitate success among COs.
So several things triggered for me, and TaLisa hits a lot of things quickly. So I had two paths in my head I wanted to go down, but I love the the reflection on the bad apples. It was particularly something I used early in my work around sexual abuse, because whether it's the military, churches, boarding schools, colleges, often the response when there's an incident is there are always a few bad apples. And that few bad apples theory lasts about 125 years in corrections. And as long as you say a few bad apples, then it takes away leadership responsibility. And TaLisa, I think what you're talking about when you talk about the rotten barrel, you're talking about the systemic need for leadership. And so leadership and accountability. And so that's one piece that I really connect to around what you're saying, that taking it from the individuals to the systemic issues that really create that environment. And so the other thing I'd like to reflect on is we have a wonderful project with the Bureau of Justice Assistance to go to training academies throughout the country. And so we've now been to 11. It's a national scan to look at what is the current training, not only for officers, but for non-custody staff as well. And the outcome of this will be guiding principles for the Contemporary Training Academy. And so we are largely implementing training with exceptions, in the same way we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, in terms of what we teach, with some obviously updates with technology. But I think we've got to get better at not only at the content that we teach, but also the instructional design that we use, and the engagement of staff. In addition to people leaving because of poor supervision, they also leave because they're not engaged. And they want, most people, not all people, but most people want to be engaged. They want to know why they're working. They want to know the why of what we're doing. And so I think we would be very much in concert around the need to look systemically at how we support staff. I don't think we should get everybody a pass to be a bad apple if they've had poor training and poor supervision. But I think you speak very articulately, I think, about where the gaps are, and that I often use the expression, my only surprise is that we're surprised. If we're not developing people to do the things we're asking them to do, why are we surprised they're not doing them? So thank you for all that you said. I hope I responded in a way that at least covered some of it.
It's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Andie. And so, TaLisa, I'm just throwing all these quotes in your book right back at you, TaLisa. So I apologize for that. It's like you write it down and you're going to get asked about it. But you write in your book that, and I agree with this statement, that society stigmatizes and undervalues correctional officers. And so I'd like to ask both of you, maybe we can start with TaLisa since it's your sentence, and then get Andie's take as well. Why do you think that's the case? And how do you think that affects CO morale and work performance?
Yeah, so I think, similar to what Andie said about kind of like this professionalism in corrections, and I really need to learn more about the Moss Group, honestly, after this, because You've been doing what I aspire to do for such a long time. But I think what happens is when society stigmatizes and undervalues COs, the translation of that in terms of morale and work performance is that the focus becomes on getting home safely. Like, I'm here, I'm doing my job, and I need to get home, right? And you'll hear that, right, on the ground, that it's really going home safe every day. I need to get home. That's a good day. What is a good day like? Going home safely, right? Getting home is a good day. A boring shift is a good shift, right? And so instead of focus on improving the environment, improving kind of the carceral conditions, trying to kind of give trauma-informed care, trying to kind of nurture and make sure everything is really super tight and on point, people start focusing on getting home safely, right? They kind of try to put themselves in context properly, right? What my research finds is that when people do opt into work in corrections, they do so because they want to make a change. And I think that this is fascinating because it really kind of ties to what Andie just said. People want change, right? So, once they get there, they're like, yes, I want to work in corrections. I've studied about it. I know this is horrible, right? I've seen it on TV. African-Americans and Black and brown people are overrepresented, right? So many communities, kind of isms and schisms and all these things. And I want to change that. And then they get in the system and realize that the structure itself is too big for one person to shift, right? That they can do these micro level things, right? But in terms of kind of like, you can't make medical be better, right? I can't improve the quality of food, right? I can't make them turn the lights off at a reasonable hour, right? I can't change like the grade of toilet paper, right? You'd be surprised the kind of things that are super important to people who are incarcerated that we don't think about, right? Because we're not there. And so because a CO or a correctional psychologist or even somebody more administratively, they'll take these jobs thinking I can make a difference, right? I can teach in this space. I can be a drug counselor in this space. I used to be in this space, right? A peer counselor. I used to be incarcerated. I want to come back and give. And then you face the structure itself and realize what a shadow it casts over our efforts. And it's demoralizing, and people just start wanting to go home. And so I think ultimately, until we put corrections officers and corrections staff and corrections as a discipline in the same kind of priority. Now, I am not advocating, let me just say, I'm not advocating for the expansion of the carceral model. That's not what I'm advocating for. But I'm advocating for us to better recognize and understand the touch points of humanity that we're overlooking because we've looked the other way, right? Into a lot of the realities of the system. So I want to make that very clear for my abolitionists on the call. That's not what I'm saying, right? That we need to expand the carceral model, but instead we need to be more respectful and mindful of the conditions that we place all humans under when they interact with that system, regardless of the color of their uniform.
Andie, I'd love to hear from you.
Well, I'm glad what you just said. I'm not interested in expanding incarceration either, but what I am interested in is, as long as we have it, that we have dignity for the staff and the population, and that we're about healing.
Yep.
Dr. Stephanie Covington has just written a book called Hidden Healers, and I had the opportunity to be involved with it a little bit, but her point is that whether you're talking about the food service supervisor or you're talking about a line staff person that's there at 2 a.m. in the morning, kind words and belief in someone can change their life. And a lot of times these are hidden healers, and the population working with each other, their friendships, their support of one another. And so there's a lot of hidden healing going on, I think, in the facility. And I'm not Pollyanna. There's not enough of that going on by any means, but I do think there's some positives there for sure. And the approach I take, because it could be discouraging otherwise, is we can only do our chapter and we can only do what's in front of us. And I was trying to remember, it triggered me when you were talking about this. I can't remember the author, who's a change leadership person, that we can only change the 3 feet around us, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But that goes into the river of change. And if we think in terms of we want to change the full system by ourselves, that's not a winning effort. But that speaks how important partnerships are. I think corrections personnel with advocates, with people with lived experience, and really learning to listen and respect each other. I often say in training, I can change the culture in corrections without spending a dime. if everyone, both staff, the population, our stakeholders, if everyone spoke in respectful language, we could change the culture. And so I do think that there are ways to respond to this overwhelming systemic, really depression. I mean, we can get fairly discouraged, particularly with our workforce crisis. But all we're called to do, and that's my language, is to do that chapter that's in front of us, and to expand as much as we can the synergy among us to really help with that stigma issue. I mean, correctional staff responds very well, just as the population does, to respectful language, but also if I had to do an elevator speech, I would say, how do we turn fear-based environments to hope-based environments? And that's if we are hope-based, then whether they're officers or they're the clinician or they're the food service person, if they feel like they're engaged in an operation that's about hope, not everybody 100% comes around to that, but it's a pretty powerful concept. Particularly, no one wants to work in a fear-based environment. No one wants to live in a fear-based environment. No one wants their loved ones in a fear-based environment. So I think the whole issue of being stigmatized is something that calls all of us who have any influence to really put more effort than we ever have into really helping these environments becoming hope-based, because we do have a lot pulling on us. But I'm forever an optimist, and I think staying in the game is so important right now, which should be a powerful statement coming from somebody who's trying to retire, but it's just so compelling, all that there is to do. So I appreciate the question about stigma, because I think that's the hardest thing. Imagine being an officer who's faced with their own safety every day and having small children or having a loss in their family that they have to integrate. And then think of our population. I met with some long-termers, some women recently, to talk about how do you grieve? How do you deal with loss in this setting? And it was so powerful to me. I've recently had a significant loss in my life, and it's made me think, how in the world do our men and women who are incarcerated integrate loss of family members they haven't seen and they won't see? And so our work is really important. We have to work in spite of the fact that we're stigmatized.
Yeah, I want to bring the grief point. I mean, I just need to call out the work of my colleague, Dr. Robert Johnson, who's been at American longer than I have been alive. So like a real commitment to the field. And he does work on the death penalty, particularly correctional staff who work in those environments. And the grief, right? This expected, but the cycle of grief of, essentially spending years, right? Because that's how long it takes, right? Years interacting with someone, and then the loss of that, right? So there's also loss on that kind of that side. And I don't think people think about it in the same way. Same thing. So when I was a correctional officer, there was this interesting dynamic of, and that was 10 years ago, maybe 12, whatever, who's counting. But when I was a correctional officer, someone would leave, right? They would be released. I worked in a jail, so they'd be released. And then hours later, they could come back in for trespassing, right? And then they'd be released again and then trespass again. But it's that upon return, there was shame, right? That they expressed coming back and seeing me, right? Carter, I don't want to talk. Carter, don't look at me. Carter, I know. Right. So there is this interesting, so not only grief, but loss, right? And this interesting level of excitement that I had upon release, right? For them to be out, right? And then this interesting disappointment or wait to see them again, right? And to have to start over. Very different than students in the classroom, right? We all want to, graduate, pass the class, right? It's a different, even when my students get an F, that weight holds different than seeing someone return back to the incarcerated population. And then the last thing I'll say about grief is just something that's an interesting intersection with the Prison Rape Elimination Act, right? PREA, so when I was a correctional officer, I had this experience where an incarcerated person was waiting for a visit. That they never showed up. We were watching TV that night, and the people who were supposed to come visit got in a fatal car accident, passed away. PREA prevented me from allowing her peers to hug her, right? Because that contact is not prohibited. And so grief even that, right? Me as kind of this young 20-year-old regulating other people's grief, right? In this really enforcement way, right? This way that's not kind of akin to my natural orientation at all, right? But hey, when the psychologist and therapists get here, you can talk to the therapist, maybe, you know, but I can't let you hug. It was amazing to not let someone hug after they're watching, right, on TV, the death of loved ones. And so I think that, again, I just bring these stories up because the complications of what humanity looks like in this environment is just beyond what one can really imagine unless you've experienced it, right? And my work, my professional career as an officer was is a short-term situation with a lifelong impact. So I can't imagine, you know, it being something in the reverse, right? So I just wanted to bring that up because grief and then like the laws that we have to enforce and what we can and can't allow, just human emotion, it really exists in the space in a way that we just haven't captured at all with our scholarly work.
So David, you're going to have to do a whole nother round on this probably, because that triggers a lot for me around PREA and overcorrection and some of the unintended consequences of implementing PREA. But I know that's beyond our scope, but the point that Dr. Carter is making is so important. The humanity and the cultural collisions that go on inside our facilities are complicated. And so thank you for that.
So we have actually a number of really great questions from the audience. So I think I'll actually go ahead and pivot to those now, if that's all right with my guests today. And the first of these is what I see to be a million-dollar question, not in that it's a tough one, but in that there are lots and lots of ideas about it. So eager to hear from both of you. What makes a good correctional officer? And what can DOCs do to help a person to be a good correctional officer? And maybe I'll start with Andie and then go to TaLisa after.
Well, I'm going to surprise you and give you a simple answer. I had the opportunity when I was early in my career to listen to a leadership guru, teaches all over the world. And he said, it's real easy to become a good whatever. He said, it's a 4-letter word, just care, just show you care. And I think whether you're an officer or you're an educator or you're the maintenance person, people know the difference. They know if you're authentic or if you're not. And so a good correctional officer obviously pays attention to what the policies are. A good correctional officer does their part in creating what I would refer to as a reporting environment, which is one that corruption is not tolerated. And a good correctional officer is kind. But a good correctional officer also knows their limits and understands boundaries. And that's a tricky art, is to understand the boundaries of the population we serve and also be very relational so that they feel some hope. There's sort of the formal part of being a good correctional officer. And then there's really the value and heart part. And people will know, just like we know in our other professions and our daily contacts. If you're authentic and you're learning your craft, there's a lot to learn as a correctional officer. There's a lot to learn about the mechanics of being a correctional officer. There's a lot to learn about how do you take care of yourself and when you go home. And what are my opportunities? I think correctional officers need to know that we have a profession, there's a lot of opportunities. You can start as a correctional officer and you can be director of a department. And so I don't think we talk enough about career opportunities. I've had an enormous, I'm at the place where I can look at the arc of my career, enormous opportunities. At least half of my jobs didn't exist before. There was a gap and there was something that needed to be done and it was messy and I had the opportunity to do it. So we want to encourage our folks to think you're not just in a job, but a good correctional officer, we would hope would get hooked into being in a career.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. TaLisa.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo what Andie said, honestly, because it was that perfect, right? Again, I love the way Andie started, like to be good at anything, right? And even though people hate when I say it, I run a wing the same way I run my classroom. Nothing has changed, right? Nothing has changed because, I am, I understand they're human, but I don't take excuses, right? I understand you want phone time, but you have to have order, right? Like so nothing has changed between when I jumped careers. It was very easy because it's the same exact skill set. You follow the rules. People need grace, right? So I think what Andie said, I echo everything. And just to say, like, yes, I run my wing the way I run my classroom, and that's how I personally know, right? Consistency across context, across space, right? That it was a good experience.
A classroom or schoolroom is
Right,
a learning
sorry, y'all.
space in which both children.
It was my echo. But I think when you can be consistent and show up the same across context, show up in a way that's caring and kind and still enforcing rigor and fairness and order.
Okay, we can leave it there,
That's how you
TaLisa.
can tell.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I want to ask a question about, I guess, a class of correctional staff that we've not talked a lot about in the session so far. And that is that obviously there are lots and lots and lots of people that work within correctional facilities that aren't in security posts, right? They're the teachers, they're the nurses, they're the doctors, all of the folks that provide the care that people need in those facilities beyond security, right? And so we know that because of the workforce crisis that we find ourselves in, a solution to a lot of the staffing constraints within facilities has been to ask non-security staff to staff security positions, right? So people who maybe teach in the GED program or people who are responsible for a library are now working shifts in some states to basically keep the prison functioning at a basic level. So do we think maybe that is sort of being seen by that population of folks as a punishment? Or do we think that that's going to create problems for the non-security folks when they think about their career in corrections? How is that as a short-term solution to a bigger problem in your view? I'll open that to either of you. Maybe Andie, I don't know if you've worked with facilities on this recently, but curious what both of you might have to say.
I have worked with these and currently working with these facilities on this issue. One is I believe in teamwork. During COVID, everybody needs to do whatever is needed to be done to keep people safe and healthy. And so there was a lot of that. And people use different language about that assignment. But as many people on this call may know, the Federal Bureau of Prisons has always had your correctional officer first, or you go through correctional officer training as well as being a teacher and so forth. So there's been a lot of, of that process that you're talking about in terms of covering the post. I know, and I'm working with a facility now where the wardens had to come in and run a post. They have 80% vacancy on their security staff. So, everybody has to pitch in. It's not a long-term solution because every time that happens, other things aren't happening. And so I think we have to be careful of making COVID an excuse, even though it's a very valid excuse for many things. But if we're not having GED classes, if we're shutting down the gym, if we are cutting corners and our chaplains aren't available for chaplaincy services, then it's going to start to rot. I mean, it's going to start to really create a toxic environment that is very, very discouraging. And on top of, in most cases, in all cases, I guess, facilities have been through a period of time where the population can't even get out of their room. And so that's very detrimental. So it's not going to solve the long-term workforce issues or even the midterm workforce issues. But certainly as a crisis strategy during COVID, we had to all hands on deck. So I'm not critical of that. It's just in the strategic thinking about it, we will really go backwards and we will not be helping people with opportunity if we just do that as a practice.
TaLisa, did you want to weigh in on that? I know you had some audiovisual issues there for a moment, so not sure if you were able to hear the question.
Yeah. Is the question the impact of COVID on kind of the conditions of correctional misconduct or that facility?
Or just the idea that we have some folks that are not security staff being asked to staff security positions. And so how is it we're able to navigate those dynamics?
Yeah, so I love this question because there are oftentimes people that are not, so I've been in trainings where like people that are psychologists or not actually security staff take on correction security training understanding that when conditions are dire, they would have to fill those roles. Often, also, it's really common, kind of like what I mentioned, to try to get people to training. Probation officers will kind of sit in, so correctional officers can be trained, right? Because probation is a part of corrections. We don't talk about it in the same way, unfortunately, but definitely is. And so I think that security training should be for everyone in an institution, right? Just as some of the training of non-security folks like therapists and counselors, and we need to kind of balance out training for both sides. And that's just because of the unique conditions of the carceral environment. Unfortunately, although vast majority of the time nothing goes down, when something does go down, it is, as Andie said, all hands on deck, right? COVID, etc. I don't think it's a flaw of an institution to ask that of people in a crisis, right? But I do think that it's a flaw, again, of an institution not to properly prepare people to make that shift.
And that actually gets to another question that I'd like to ask, and I want to give Andie actually an opportunity to answer this because she's been doing so much good work on it, and that is the academies that a lot of DOCs run. And there's been a movement, I think, at least I've seen it anecdotally, and Andie, if this has not been your observation, let me know, but I've seen a lot of academies being shortened or being sort of run not to the level that they'd like to be run because they need bodies in seats, right, in jobs and in positions. And so I'm wondering how we can maybe better think about those academies and what they're doing, and how we might restructure them and reform them in a way that would make them maybe more productive or more ideal than they currently are.
Well, thank you for the question. We're learning a lot in our work around training academies. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned is that we actually have 5 generations in the workforce now. And so how we're training incoming staff, we've lowered the age, we've lowered requirements in many states for a new correctional officer. And we're bringing in correctional officers that have never been without their technology. And so we're, in some cases, doing lesson plans we did 10 years ago without anything creative about it. And I don't want to be all negative, because I think there are a lot of heroic efforts going on by training staff. But even with that, field training officers, for instance, that would be in a facility and help people in their first number of weeks, filling those positions and keeping consistency is really difficult. And so with what we're learning through training academies, it's a really deep and wide understanding of what's really happening in the field, and recognizing that there are some things that we can do about that. We can influence instructional design and some of the ways in which we train people who are doing the training. We can use more technology. We can use more hybrid classes. But it is impacting the point that and one of the points you were making, David, about rushing to get people into the facilities. That is happening. But we pay now or pay later, right? And while I work with men and women, both the staff and in leadership development, I'm also working a good deal with women coming into the system, and they're scared. They're young. The men are scared too. I don't mean that. But I think if women are going into a male facility or men are going into a women's facility, there's additional training and awareness that we need to add in. And some of those things that we'd like to create in training, as I don't see them as secondary classes. I think I see them as real critical. We're just having a struggle getting in all the information we really need to get in. But I think the critical thing is that the training we do of staff has got to relate to what their day-to-day reality is going to be when they go to the facility. And if that's not true, we lose people pretty quickly. And so when training doesn't reflect that, and that's been an ongoing issue, not just now, but it is, I keep going back to, you're right on target. We've got to have different conversations because of the workforce crisis, and how we keep people in training, how long we keep them in training, what the creativity can be about training them on site. Those are all really critical questions. How to use technology without misusing technology. So I think, to me, if I had $1 to spend, I'd spend it on supervisory training, frankly. But because the supervisors need to model, need to support, and need to know how to build that morale that's going to be in the facility. That may be a little bit more than you asked for, but we're very engaged in this project, and we're getting a lot of information.
No, that's fantastic. I appreciate that. And I actually, something you said links back to a different question that I want to ask TaLisa, which is that, Andie, you mentioned 5 generations in the workforce, and you talked through different sort of generational things. And TaLisa, I'm wondering if we're thinking about rewards and sanctions, and we're thinking about the 18-year-old and then the 45-year-old, how do those things look different for those groups, or do they look different for those groups?
Yeah, so I think what my research would suggest is that one, kind of tenure, right? So clearly, if you've made it in the game, made it in corrections workforce for 5-10 years, you figured out a system, right? Whereas an 18-year-old, I'm assuming, is just not going to have the time. But let's say we're in a new training, a new cohort, and there's an 18-year-old cadet and a 45-year-old cadet. I think it's really about interpersonal communication skills on the part of the supervisor, which was what Andie said, but in this case, kind of the training instructor. And I've seen that in all of the kind of facilities I've visited, is that there is kind of this customization of response, right? Particularly in training, because we need people to graduate and get in, right? That there's kind of this willingness to kind of this expectation that people will fall short. Now, actually on the force, it's a little different, because the thing that's missing from training academies is the informal training that happens when you're on the job. It's very much similar to kind of which professor you take, right? Criminology 101 or English 101 or Algebra 101 with, right? There are so many sections of it we teach a bunch of them, but who you get will matter, will shape your experience. And it's the same thing for training. It's the same thing for COs running a unit, right? It's really about not only kind of responding to praises and punishments generationally, but do you have the capacity, right? Is it in your character, your personality? Is it something that you can tap into to give people what they need when they need it? Do you even have the self-awareness? And that's hard to teach, right? And so, right, the California Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections Rehabilitation, or sometimes I get that mixed up. So if you're from California, you can correct me. But in that facility, right, they started using these kind of mechanisms where you can take a screening test that's supposed to predict if you are psychologically capable of remaining on the job for at least a year, right? And they adapted that mechanism from policing. Right? The vast majority of states don't do that, but essentially we need people to last longer than a year, right? Right. And so there is no test for that, right? There's no test for longevity except for kind of putting people in the water and seeing if they can float. And there are consequences to that as well. So I think for an 18-year-old, as much as we kind of expect like this, they need kind of grounding and sanctions, same thing for a fresh out 45-year-old, because nothing can prepare you for those conditions. We really just need to kind of ground our expectations of what training is, what praise looks like, what sanctions look like, and also elevate the importance of being human on the job.
David, can I add something to that?
Please.
Never mind. Go for it. I'm sorry.
It's all right. We're pretty much, I think, needing to wrap up at this point, which is unfortunate because we have a ton more questions and a lot of interest from the audience in what both of you had to say. So I really appreciate both of you joining today, and I encourage all of you to look up Andie Moss and the Moss Group, look into the wonderful work they've been doing on academies and everything else that they have going at the moment, which is a lot. But also be on the lookout for TaLisa's new book, which will be coming out hopefully soon. And I know, TaLisa, you have a webpage that you have for yourself and all of your work. So you can look there to see as that's released and able to be purchased and downloaded. So thank you both again for joining. For those of you who joined today, please remember you can look at the speaker bios in more detail, and also reference the recording of today's session on our event page. And also please remember to take this short event survey if you would, to give us some feedback. Thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.